welcome back, everyone, to the final session of the morning, in which we move from the German debate on China and the German relationship with China, though that will be inescapable, I think, in this panel as well, to the wider European relationship with China. We have another really great group of speakers. Since you have, I think, the full bios in your conference packs and things, I will not introduce them at the length they each deserve, but going from my right, Martin Hála, founder and director of Sinopsis, Gudrun Wacker from SVP. Moving over to my left, we have Katja Drinhausen from MERICS, and on my far left, Ana Krstinovska from ESTIMA. They're all going to give we're going to do this again largely with a bit of Q&A and discussion on the panel, and then I think we'll have some time both for questions in the room and also some remote questions this time as well from the people who are listening online. And I'd ask everyone on the panel just to kick us off with giving a kind of a take at the end of what has been an extremely eventful year in different ways on the Europe-China relationship, just to give a bit of a stock take on how each of them sees it, not only for Europe as a whole, but from each of their different vantage points. We discussed a lot the effect of the Ukraine war, the China-Russia relationship. We're just coming out of Party Congress. We're just coming out of this first round of meetings that's taken place between Xi Jinping and various European leaders in several years in person. I wonder how, we talked about how the debates had moved in Germany in recent years. I wonder if you can talk about how you see this for Europe as a whole. And we'll start to my right with Martin.
Good morning, everybody. So I guess I'll just say a few words about the view from Central and Eastern Europe, or perhaps more specifically, because Central and Eastern Europe is kind of an artificially grouped together region. It's actually three regions when you think about it: the Baltics, the Visegrad countries in Central Europe, and then the Balkans. I'll leave the Balkans part to Ana, I think. So I'll just talk a little bit about the immediate neighborhood where I live. And there, and particularly in the Czech Republic, the debate has been shifting for quite a while. It's the image of the PRC and the CCP has been plummeting for several reasons. You will remember that the region once was trying to pursue its own independent policy towards China under the label of 16+1. That didn't go very well, and actually sort of backfired against the People's Republic of China, because essentially all of the expectations have been frustrating. So there's this promise fatigue now in evidence for a couple of years now. And in some countries in the region, like in the Czech Republic, there were also specific incidents that contributed to the fast-changing image of the PRC. In the Czech Republic in particular, it was the collapse of the company, of the Chinese company CEFC, a very embarrassing event for the PRC. This was a company that essentially dominated the bilateral relationship between the Czech Republic and China, but also was active in other parts of Eastern Europe. And it turned out not only to be a financial fraud, but also a tool for massive political corruption in various parts of the world, mostly in Africa, and also in the United Nations. So ever since that time, the view of China has been going down quite fast, and lately, I guess since the pandemic and the face mask diplomacy, it's basically a free fall in a big chunk of the region, with some countries, of course, being outliers like Hungary.
Gudrun.
Okay, because we heard in the previous session a lot about Germany, so I will focus probably more on the EU. And I would say, if you want to find a headline for what the EU has been doing over the last years, reflecting the changes in thinking about China, The headline would be resilience and at home and diversification. And I think we have come pretty far on the resilience level. So the EU has prepared a whole toolbox of instruments they can use. Investment screening for the European Union is one, although in the end the decision on any investment will be still in the member state. There is a trade defense mechanism, anti-subsidy regulation, public procurement to make sure that public procurement is happening in a fair way. And most of these tools are defensive in nature. There is one where we can argue whether it will be defensive. It's not really done yet. It's the anti-coercion instrument. And if you look at the case of Lithuania, that is sanctioned by China, including all EU member states that deliver goods to Lithuania or whose parts are used in production in Lithuania. The EU did not have this anti-coercion instrument yet and had to go to the WTO to say China is using unfair trade practices. But once this anti-coercion instrument is in place, this could be used in such a case if one of the EU member states is coerced by a third country. So we have come pretty far, I would say, and at a rapid speed compared to, if you watch the usual EU process in doing things like that, we have come pretty far. The diversification dimension I see mainly in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Germany has guidelines, the Netherlands has published their own guidelines on the Indo-Pacific, but it's happening more on the diplomatic front. So more visits, this was mentioned earlier already, if you look at Scholz's itinerary. But the diversification we really have in mind, the economic one, away from China, reducing the dependency, this has not really happened to a large degree. So I would say, because this depends very much on the companies and not on legislation, or governments can tell their companies whatever, and they just go where the profit is. So this is not going to be so easy, but it also turned out not to be easy for others like Japan. On the party congress, what struck me was we had a bigger debate in Germany about, Costco buying into Hamburg port than on the 20th party congress, which I think is disproportionate because the 20th Party Congress is a big step in the direction of a dictatorship. Let's face it, Xi Jinping has surrounded himself with acolytes, and so it's a little bit counterintuitive that the EU is now trying to repair, in a way, the relationship with China and get it back on a more constructive track, which, I doubt whether the conditions are really there, and I leave it at that.
And I think we'll come back to the China-Russia dimension of that, which also came up in the first session. Katja.
Is the microphone?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yes, I want to pick up actually on the last point that Gudrun just mentioned. After 3 years of, the impossibility of visits, of speaking in person, or at least only in a very limited and top-level capacity, we're at a point in EU-China relations where mutual perceptions are really discoupled. We're talking about discoupled discourses, discoupled ideological spheres, and to some extent really discoupled realities. Because at least after the Party Congress, there is a bit of a tendency in debates in Europe to look at, power consolidation under Xi Jinping, a bit of a shaky economic situation in China, and the zigzagging around zero-COVID policy, to wonder if the Chinese leadership is also turning back to a more pragmatic approach, is more approachable in terms of, and amiable in terms of finding compromise with Europe. But I think this is a really good point in time to think back to what the fundamental assumptions of the Chinese Communist Party and the leadership are when it comes to managing its international relations. And there, under Xi Jinping, it's really clear that political and ideological security and regime security are still front and center, driving international and domestic behavior. And what does that mean for Europe? It means it's really important to look at what China within China is saying about how it wants to manage its relations with Europe and what the expectations are at this point in time. And if you look at what's spelled out, it's really quite clear. Europe is supposed to stick to economy, focus on mending economic relations and keeping up good economic relations with China. It is supposed to stay away from political issues or not politicize issues, meaning staying away from issues around Xinjiang, Hong Kong, the status of Taiwan. And last but not least, the expectation quite clearly spelled out is also to leverage its strategic autonomy, as is often emphasized by the Chinese leadership, which essentially means sticking away, not sticking to the US or splitting away when it comes to core issues in relations. And the point or the question we really need to ask ourselves at this moment is, what happens if Europe doesn't play along? What kind of are the driving forces, and what is the toolkit developed in the past few years in terms of asserting China's interests and defending China's interests? And I think this has been one of the core topics of this conference really in the past few days. What has China built to manage public discourse internationally and to project its interests? And I think this is where we're going to hear really interesting input in relation to other regions in Europe as well.
Yeah, Anna, talk in particular, if you can, about how this is playing out in the Balkans.
Thank you. I will pick up where the previous speakers left, especially Martin, who mentioned that the Balkans are somehow an outlier or a different sub-region in this grouping that somehow China imposed to the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And just for context, the Balkans is actually composed of countries that are EU members, such as Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Hungary, but also countries that are not EU members, and that is to a very big extent shaping their relationship with China, because these countries do not see the EU representing them and their interests, so they are all seeking in their own way to pursue relationship, mostly for economic benefits with China, but also to pursue their own strategic considerations, as is namely the case of Serbia. And in this context, there was a research published a couple of months ago by CIPA, who tried to see to which extent China has influence in the information space or in the media space in Central and Eastern Europe. And if you see the first top 3, even top 5, or even the dominance within the top 10 countries, you would see that the Balkan countries seem to be most exposed and also most vulnerable to Chinese influence. And that is also translated in the region's perception on China. We mentioned that the perception throughout Europe and in many EU countries on China is deteriorating, that people seem to be somehow disenchanted with China and with the recent developments. But if we consider the Balkans, there seems to be simply no debate or minimal debate on China and on Chinese impact throughout the world, even after the war in Ukraine. And if you consider, for instance, the Western Balkans, the perception is not only not deteriorating, but it is improving. And there was an NDI research survey comparing 2018 to 2021. And in many of the countries, we see an increase in the positive perceptions on China, which is, in the case of North Macedonia, for instance, 13 percentage points of the people think more favorably about China in 2021 compared to 2018. And in the case of Serbia, when people are even asked whether you want to pursue closer relationship and join the EU, if it means somehow severing the relationship with China, it is the first time that more than 50% of the population says no. So this is particularly worrying given that we are not in Asia. We are in Europe and surrounded by EU countries, and yet we see this close relationship and this particular strategic hub for Chinese interests inside Europe.
They're extremely interesting numbers. I think my sense is, and Martin, you were alluding to this in your talk, that in much of Europe the numbers have been kind of collapsing for China in public opinion, and we're also seeing something, as you were talking about. I mean, we've seen essentially the collapse of the 17+1 into the 16+1 into the 14+1 into whatever is kind of left from this. I wondered if you might just say a word. I mean, Katja talked about what China wants from Europe. Is China getting what it wants right now? Are its strategies and approaches at the moment successful? And are we seeing any kind of recalibration in approach at the moment? We had a kind of very belligerent diplomatic approach, at least in parts of Europe, through COVID and the handling of the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion. What are you seeing now, and how effective is China right now in getting what it wants, particularly in the countries that you're most focused on?
Right. I think that China is not only not getting what they want from Europe as a whole, and in particular this region outside of the Balkans, but that they're in a little bit of a shock of how quickly things deteriorated, particularly in this region, from the euphoria of the 16+1 to the current situation as exemplified, for instance, by the relationship or the lack of relationship between Lithuania and the PRC. It is evidenced, actually, that there is this kind of a shock by the number of envoys that the PRC has been sending to Europe as a whole, but also Central and Eastern Europe. So I think that the previous assumptions of Chinese foreign policy about this particular region and perhaps Europe in general have largely failed, and in some cases, like the 16+1 notion, actually backfired.
Gudrun, I mean, it used to be that it was the 16+1 and then the 17+1 that was this kind of point of criticism for Europe's capacity to act collectively and for European unity, and that this was splitting Europe and things like that. The criticism more recently, I'd say even in recent couple of months, has been particularly directed at Germany on this. There was a sort of Franco-German 2+1 concept that people sometimes refer to. We don't even have a 2+1 at the moment right now, as we saw with the Scholz visit and the approach that was taken to France on that, where we won't go into all the details on what played out. But I wonder, I mean, going back to the first session, I mean, are we in a position at the moment to pull together in important ways on the European side, or in that one area that it seems that China does want, still being able to separate off certain countries, and Germany as we have seen in the index that will be released later today is still target number one. I mean, how are you seeing Germany's capacity to pull Europe together and act with the weight of the EU as a whole, let alone the transatlantic dimension of this?
Well, I think I'm sometimes very critical of my own country, and I think one of the problems, and this does not only apply to China policy, is that if you listen to German politicians, you sometimes think, by definition, everything that Germany is doing is in the interest of the European Union and in the framework of the European Union, while the rest of Europe does not perceive it that way. And that's the problem. I mean, it's not. But it's always declared as being in the European interest. And I mean, the 17+1 is a good example, because there was heavy criticism from Germany, and the counter-argument of the Central and Eastern European countries was, what do you want? You have government-to-government cabinet consultations with China, if you give up those, you know, we are just trying to have a photo op with the Chinese prime minister or something like that. So this criticism is actually fair. And I think that why we are criticized so heavily has exactly to do with what was discussed in the previous session, that Germany looks as if its China policy is driven mainly by economic interests and economic interests of certain companies, our automotive industry, our chemical industry, and Siemens, which is sort of all over the place in terms of its engagement. And they do not want to leave China. They argue if the Chinese market is no longer there, this will have very negative repercussions also for the wealth in Germany and our GDP. So what they are preparing, I think, is, either to make their Chinese assets completely independent if push comes to shove, or to sell them. But they will not decouple. They will not withdraw. And this makes us open to criticism. And the other problem of the German government has been in the past, it doesn't listen to others. It assumes a certain position, and this has been the case with Russia. I wanted to say something about China-Russia issue and whether, you know, they get what they want. Just as a small example for what Katrin said, it's almost as if we live in two different universes. China sees itself as neutral on the Ukraine war, and it doesn't understand, Chinese academics don't understand the magnitude of this conflict and the impact it had on European thinking. And this is partly because they call it a crisis. They talk about the Ukraine issue or the Ukraine crisis, and it's not a war from their perspective, or not in their language. And this is part of the problem we are dealing with, and we have somehow to bridge this widening gap of, just not totally underestimating what is going on in the partner country.
So I would like to come back to the China-Russia issue as well, and how far that's been affecting European thinking. But before that, you watched the debates very closely in China on Europe as well. I mean, what have you been seeing in the analysis of what's going on in those dynamics? Again, this question of what's working, what's not working. How big are the kind of gaps in perceptions?
I mean, here I want to pick up on the question you asked Gudrun, which is, can Germany pull the EU together? And I think that is the same expectation from China, right? If you look at Chinese debates, it's just that they're expecting Germany to pull Europe into a very different direction. So especially if you look at recent coverage of the Scholz visit, both by Chinese state media, but also official statements, and analysis from German scholars, European scholars, really focusing on understanding how we see current issues, then it's really clear that there is a very homogeneous debate and a very kind of unified message, which is that, Germany should lead the way in convincing the EU to refocus, again, more on the positive side of relations, on the economic aspects, to keep politics where possible out of it. A lot of use of language like pragmatic, rational, realistic, to remind the EU and Germany specifically what is expected of it. Then also it's interesting, I think, to look at how different European countries and leaders are viewed in the Chinese debates, because just to use Scholz as an example as well, there really is this perception that, especially after the visit and him kind of wielding his power on the Costco deal, that he is the shaker and maker that can bring the German Foreign Office and, for example, the Ministry of Economics to their heels and make sure that they don't disturb or upset German Chinese, and they're about also European-Chinese relations much more. Here I would like to point to this really fantastic analysis by EcoWall, for example, as well, that looked at what Chinese academics were saying about different German political parties. And there's this really strong perception that whatever is happening in terms of the German-China debate is driven by a small extreme minority, mostly FDP and the Green Party. And once these voices are drowned out, that everything will go back to normal. And I think this is really dangerous to see this kind of misperception on the Chinese side as well, because it really overlooks quite fundamental shifts in terms of public perception of China as well. Yes, everybody's still interested in keeping good economic relations, but based on a recent poll, I think by Kerber Foundation, more and more people are willing to, for example, sacrifice some of the economic benefits if their country steps up and, for example, defends human rights and takes a more assertive position there. So in terms of communication with our counterpart, China, because we're talking about a more constructive way forward, it's really important to kind of burst these different discursive and ideological bubbles and kind of talk facts of what is happening.
Anna, as your initial comments indicated, there are things that China is doing that is working, that are working in the Balkans. What is that? Why do you think there has been this traction in the last period of time there that's different?
Thank you. Well, I would like to make 3 points, and the first one is to actually clarify that China's interest in the Balkans is not in individual Balkan countries per se. The Balkans and even the non-EU countries in the Balkans serve as a sort of a springboard for China to be able to penetrate the EU, the European single market, which is actually the focus of China's interests in Europe. And just one example where we actually see that, the CRBC, the Chinese company that built the Pelješac Bridge in Croatia, the first big infrastructure project that a Chinese company won to build with European structural funds, was actually the same company that built the Pupin or the Friendship Bridge in Serbia 10 years ago. So this is how Chinese companies are actually using the region, and the ease or how easy it is to actually work in the Balkans and in the Western Balkans to be actually able to work and to penetrate more easily in the EU and the European single market. And then what is the reaction on the side of the Balkan countries, where they're actually looking up to Germany and to the EU, and they're saying, well, if Germany pursues its economic interest, then it's very much legitimate for us to be pursuing our own interests, and that is where the EU should step in and should work on speaking with one voice and consolidating internally, but also somehow getting on board all these countries that are somehow gravitating towards the EU. Because China's economic influence in the region is still very limited. It is the EU that is the region's biggest trade partner, investor, donor, etc. And the region is a part of the disenchantment that the 17 or 16+1 experienced with China, because there were simply no investments. Most of the promises were not fulfilled and were not met. So it would be actually, as a final point, it would be very interesting to see how the war in Ukraine will, and if it will change the relations, especially because we see countries like Serbia, which is the only country in Europe that has not introduced sanctions on Russia and has this ever closer relationship with China. But apart from Serbia, I think that the other countries are suffering seriously the consequences of the war in Ukraine, and that China is simply not understanding this. They are not grasping that Russia is an existential threat for most of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and that most of the countries in the Balkans are also suffering gravely from this war in terms of energy implications, inflation, food supplies. So it would be very interesting to see, and unfortunately this has not been measured yet, what the response and the impact on the region would be from China's non-constructive role on the war in Ukraine.
So that was exactly the question I wanted to come to next for the panel. Katja, you talked about this. What is pragmatic, rational, and realistic. In the Chinese debate, this, of course, means continuing with economic ties as usual. Before the war, I think the criticism of, for instance, Annalena Baerbock was that the approach taken on Russia, on China, was too focused on values, was not pragmatic and realistic, and this obviously looks, what is pragmatic and realistic on Russia? The perception of that has obviously changed radically. Is there the sense that has really shifted the balance of what is seen as the pragmatic center of the debate on these issues in vis-a-vis China, that these questions around dependencies and what level of exposure makes sense? Have we really seen a kind of sea change in that, or is that kind of political battle on those questions very much still underway? I wonder if either of you might comment.
Okay, sorry, I thought it was actually for you. But anyhow, this kind of debate actually even preceded the invasion of the Ukraine, because the exposure of Eastern Europe to China economically is limited, or let me rephrase, the exposure of Central and Eastern Europe to China goes through Germany. Most of the countries here feed into the supply chains that go to Germany and then to the German export machine. So directly, the economic argument, the argument about the direct economic relationship with China has really collapsed with the 16+1 sort of fantasy. The closer economic relationship never happened, and then it sort of exploded with the undeclared secondary boycott of Lithuania. So I think, in that sense, the debate in Eastern Europe about the pragmatism of the relationship to China is not quite the same as in Western Europe. So, like I said, even before the war, it actually wasn't quite there.
Gudrun, I mean, the same question, but I mean, do you think there has been this concept of systemic rival, systemic competitor? I mean, this was first cited publicly by the BDI, notably. I mean, that you had German industry, in a sense, saying that these values questions and economic questions were intrinsically intertwined, and that there was no longer a way of kind of separating out what we were seeing in terms of the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party domestically, what we were expecting from its role in the world, and how that translated into German business interests, and that kind of separating these questions out into different lanes did not make sense, and the kind of good exposure at the beginning of their famous China paper, kind of laying this concept out. But I wonder if you similarly here, I mean, how far you see that kind of battle underway for defining what actually kind of pragmatism and realism actually is with reference to China. And sorry, one more preliminary to the question, which is this China-Russia issue more broadly that you and others might touch on. We've just had these rounds of meetings. I mean, this was the kind of the key thing from the Schultz visit, the hope that China can play a certain kind of role with Russia. We, of course, had these public statements on use or threat of nuclear weapons from Xi Jinping. There now seems to be this kind of, where earlier in the year there was a view that said the China-Russia relationship, China's an enabler, China is creating the conditions for this war, and the forms of political support that were provided with incredibly frosty meetings. Now you see in some of these meetings this, the China-Russia relationship is something that, if China can differentiate itself from Russia, this will help serve European security interests. Is that bleeding in unhelpful ways right now? Or, I mean, how do you see that piece of things?
Okay, I first of all thank you, Katrin, for answering the question I didn't answer. My answer was so indirect that I don't think that Germany can unify anybody. Anyway, I mean, this is a really important question, and I don't think it has been settled. The whole question, I mean, we're still debating the EU paper that says China is a partner, a cooperation partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. And we still try to figure out, first of all, what is the relative weight of these three dimensions? And secondly, can we really separate them? And that's the real issue. I mean, there was a lot of talk about compartmentalizing, as you said, with the lanes. But this is not working because we see that economic issues and the cooperation dimension is taken hostage for other issues. And you saw that clearly in the case of the US-China relationship when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. Not only were there military exercises and a new white paper, but the first thing the Chinese did was cancel the talks on climate, which is basically the last topic left where the US sees any ground for cooperation with China. So these different dimensions, they bleed into each other, so to speak, and you cannot no longer assume, and I think this is the lesson Germany has drawn from the Russian attack on Ukraine, that economic interdependency will sort of stabilize, act as a major stabilizer in relations. That's no longer the belief, not to mention that we had to drop the whole change through trade approach where we believe that China will change because we engage with them or something like that. I'm not so I think the debate is still going on, and we will see how in the end this will figure in the German China strategy paper. But the whole issue of values and interests. I mean, we are so open to criticism of double standards and hypocrisy, because previously you heard, for example, Vietnam as a partner for Germany now. I mean, is Vietnam a democracy? We have different sets of standards we use, and I think that's a problem. So we should look for pragmatic ways to work with countries who share certain interests. I'm not a big fan, as you know, of the American framing, mainly that this is the ultimate battle between autocracy and democracy, because you push away countries like Singapore that are not seen as democracies, right, correctly so, but they share the same interests on many issues. So I think the values thing and the democracy debate, it lures us into this false belief that democracies are like-minded on basically everything, which is not the case, and the Chinese will be the first ones to point out to you, if we talk about Russia, look at India and the Indian debate and the Indian abstention in all the relevant on all the relevant resolutions in the UN. So I think we have to find some sort of approach where we reconcile interests and values, but not preach from the moral high horse.
I mean, I thought in some ways the new US national security strategy tried to sort of thread these two pieces together, but we can talk about that. Katja, I mean, both on this wider question, but also, I mean, on how you're seeing perceptions of what's actually going on in China right now and how that's playing into the discussions here in Europe. We've seen the protests. There are these questions about kind of long-term trends in China. There are questions about what goes on if we're seeing a period of sustained weakness in the Chinese economy. I wondered if you might make a couple of comments on that, power perceptions and trajectory perceptions for China, political strength in China.
This is a really good question, especially the part about the kind of power position or power trajectory, because if we look back at our relationship with China and where China was standing just over the past 3 years, it's really been a roller coaster. So 3 years ago, pretty much, you had the outbreak of COVID, the lockdown in Wuhan, and debates in Europe if this was China's Chernobyl moment, if this was China's time to turn, if sustained calls for freedom of expression when Dr. Li Wenliang died were, going to take over not just the internet, but maybe kind of spill over into the streets and result in more outright kind of political demands for change. A year later or 2 years later, the Chinese Communist Party was triumphantly celebrating its 100th anniversary. Europe was under lockdown after lockdown. We had waves of COVID infections, whereas people in China were walking around without masks and kind of celebrating the systemic superiority of the Chinese political system. And to some extent, this was also perceived and kind of reflected here, even without adapting outright kind of Chinese official talking points. And now, kind of the situation has, turned upside down again, and we're at a point where not only is China economically in a weaker spot, it's kind of ill-prepared for opening up and kind of learning to live with the virus. We've had what everybody was kind of waiting for 3 years ago, which is demands that were voiced online, spilling out on the streets and people actually protesting and not demanding just specific policy actions, but demanding rule of law, freedom of expression, human rights, and also to some extent showing those that were very cynical in Europe about, what does the Chinese population want? Do they even care about these values? That this is something that appeals to Chinese citizens as well, and that kind of reminds Europe to some extent of a responsibility to speak up for that, and kind of to not stay in a rational and pragmatic equilibrium in terms of managing its relations with China. And what does that mean looking forward? Uncharted grounds to some extent, especially looking ahead at the coming year. But kind of coming back to my initial statement, it's really important to keep in mind what the party wants, and that is, especially in a moment of deep crisis domestically, to manage perception of itself abroad. So, especially those that participated here in their different areas working on Chinese messaging and influence operations abroad, I do think it's going to be a busy year ahead.
After Anna, I'm going to kind of come to questions from the room. I have a couple of other things, if there aren't a huge slew of questions, and questions from beyond the room. But Anna, either on the kind of points that have been made so far, or also just on perceptions on the China-Russia relationship in particular in the Balkans. I'm seeing very different views on what the China-Russia relationship actually kind of means for the relationship with China. And it's gone from a spectrum. I certainly see a number of governments in Europe who have this view that is, the differences between them can be exploited and this is something that we can benefit from, to these two are functioning in a qualitatively different strategic partnership now that has really problematic implications for our interests going forward, and we need to address them to a certain extent as a much more common threat than we ever did before. I'm wondering if you might kind of comment on that as well.
Thank you. In the Balkans, it was Russia that has traditional presence and influence that dates from several centuries ago. And I think that China, well, in the past we were talking about competition between China and Russia in the Balkans. This is increasingly less and less the case, but we are somehow seeing China building on the Russian experience. And what do I mean by that? We see the main pro-Russian minorities, I would say, in most of the countries that have somehow switched to be pro-China supporters and communities. We see the same tactics that were largely used by Russia in the area of propaganda, disinformation, that are now used more and more by China. And I think that we are not ready, and we are not very much able to deal with that. Why? Because we have maybe built more experience in dealing with Russian disinformation, but there is very, very little understanding in the region about how China works, about how China operates, what goals China pursues, because they are fundamentally different from the goals pursued by Russia. Namely, it is not to disrupt the region, to create some sort of conflict, armed conflict, because China is much more interested in the stability of the region so that it can pursue its economic interests. But it is very interesting to see this some sort of synergy in terms of the tools and the tactics whenever it suits China and Russia, and to see somehow Russia going in the back plan and China coming to the front, with many, for instance, in Serbia and in Bosnia, with many people thinking that it is China that is the main economic partner, the main donor, and this is largely due to China's propaganda and disinformation efforts, which have so far gone largely unnoticed and under the radar, and it is something that we should start thinking about.
Thanks very much. Questions? I already see a remote question and two here. Start with the remote question since it was missed from the last round. Go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, I get an online question from our online participant. It's kind of following with the previous discussion on Russia. And so the question here is, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has dealt a massive blow to the mindset of interdependence. If interdependence is not that, what is it? And how do we characterize a new mindset?
And I'll take the other questions here so that people can kind of gather and think. Yeah, at the back.
Sure. Thanks. The question that I wanted to ask was when, I forgot the name, but when you mentioned about Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and the consequences, right, and of China kind of getting out of the climate change discussions or in that aspect. So the other aspect was, like, if you look at the US, so whether it is the Uyghur Forced Labor Act or the Tibet Policy Act, there are certain consequences in terms of how China acts. And in terms of Europe, a lot of the discussions is about criticism, but the consequences is not something that I see as much. So in some ways, is there a way forward towards making sure that it's not just the criticism, but there's actual consequences to the actions that China actually undertakes, whether it's in the UN, whether it's all the different aspects of it, and if so, how does that look?
And one more at the front, and then I'll come back to the panel.
Hi, I'm from South America. I was kind of surprised because I heard this like distinction between pragmatic thinking in Europe and this high values thinking in Europe, and I wonder, isn't strategic thinking pragmatic too? Haven't you thought about the impact of the relationship with China in allegedly commercial and investment capacities? From the Ecuadorian experience, the impact of China allegedly commercial and as a creditor, as an investment partner, has been profound because they have even intervened in our politics. They have banned our institutions. They have changed, made profound changes on some laws according to their interests. So I don't know if sometimes I'm kind of surprised because I thought it's not just a matter of goodwill, of European goodwill. Have you thought or have you reflected about the experience of other regions with China investments, with China credits? That's the thing that I'm not seeing. Have you thought the impact on your own institutions in long term of this relationship if you don't have enough care with it? I'm amazed because I thought I was about to hear other things, and I can't believe that there is not a strategic and even a geopolitical dimension besides the human rights dimension in the reflections of all these themes. Sorry.
Who wants to come back on any of these?
Maybe I'll start. I'll start with the interdependence. So again, like I said, in the region where I live, there actually, and perhaps paradoxically, has been very little interdependence in terms of economic relations. There wasn't even much need for a new, what did we say, new narrative, new approach. But I think it's been always clear in this part of the world that the new narrative, the new normal, the new positioning would probably be diversification, just like in much of the world. Diversification in terms of supply chains and economic relationships in general, and in terms of the impact on the political institutions, of which we have actually seen quite a lot in Eastern Europe. It's resilience. So the new narrative is resilience, that we need to build up a more resilient system politically. The consequences of the statements on some of the grave human rights violations in places like Xinjiang, I think it's a matter of policy response, right? That does not follow the statements, the pronouncement immediately, but probably needs a little bit of time to build up. And it's, of course, quite frustrating that it's been taking too much time. But there are some signs that hopefully we will get there, hopefully sooner than later.
Let me say directly something on the last issue. I think we do see a concrete action. The EU has another new instrument which allows it to sanction, and it used sanctions in the case of Xinjiang. It was not there when the security law in Hong Kong entered force. So there was some, windy statements, but I would say a weak response. The weakness of the European Union as the European Union is, of course, that on foreign and security issues, you need everybody to be on the same page to come out with a strong statement. If there is no, if there is one dissenting voice, the statement is watered down. But in the case of Xinjiang, the sanctions entered force. The Chinese response was pretty heavy, and actually the institute where Katrin is working is under sanctions, but also the human rights part of the European Parliament, etc. And the result is also that the comprehensive agreement on investment is moving nowhere at the moment, which the Chinese, of course, want to move forward, but the European Union, I think there is nowhere in hell that the Parliament will ratify this agreement under these circumstances. So we're stuck in the mud, but there is concrete action. And I think what we need now also is contingency planning for a Taiwan scenario, whatever it will look like. There needs to be a plan. How would we respond? Of course, there needs also to be a viable policy, what we do to prevent a conflict from happening. But if a conflict breaks out and we run around like the headless chicken, it's not helpful to anybody. So I think this is ongoing. Not everything is public. And part of the signaling we see with, a stronger military engagement, this will not change the military balance in the region, but it gives a sign to China that we care. And the interdependence question, interdependence is usually an asymmetric relationship. It's rarely symmetric. And there lies the first problem, so to speak. But I think what we need is a clear picture where our critical dependencies are and where we have to reduce them. And it's probably not masks, because it's not, you know, a rocket science to produce a mask. But if you find out that antibiotics were completely dependent on China, or on respirators, or 97% of the rare earth of the world are processed in China. They might be found somewhere else, but the processing is taking place in China. Then we have to look at these dependencies and say, no, we have to diversify, lower these dependencies. That's the, I would say that's enough new thinking, but we have to make our homework first. And there we're still lagging a little bit.
Maybe quite a lot.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the language part again, especially the pragmatic and realistic. I think it's important to note that these two words, just to focus on these, mean something very, very different when China uses them and when at least some in the EU currently use them. So for China, it's essentially communicating an expectation. This is what we want Europe to do, or else. And they've shown with previous sanctions what happens, right, in case of the or else. At least partly in the European or German debate, when we talk about, you know, being realistic and being pragmatic, it's more about taking stock, what happened, what are our risks and exposures, to find a different way forwards, maybe not the one that China would regard as realistic and pragmatic. So this is really a point where it's the same words, but you know, the logic, thinking, and the path really diverge. And when it comes to the, you know, to-dos and consequences from that, I think the first one would be to kind of untangle that language, because it's really muddled at the moment, and find clearer ways to communicate, not just within our countries, in Germany and in Europe, but towards other parts of the world, for example, and to China itself, of course, but also learning from the experiences of other countries. And I'm saying that specifically from a German kind of perspective, because in terms of its relations, Germany has been in a really cozy spot with China in the past. Let's be honest about that. So that's, I guess, why, to some extent, the risks and the exposures you mentioned are less present in the public debate, and there is kind of this tendency to focus on the good side. And you mentioned before the, you know, high-level op-eds by, you know, heads of companies. And I think there it's also important to note that maybe on the surface there is still the perceived need or interest to express a constructive willingness to take a constructive approach to China, however you want to frame it. But that doesn't mean that behind closed doors there isn't a lot of concern exactly about the risks that have been debated over the past years. And that on every level, from politics to companies to civil society, societal stakeholders are thinking about different ways to move forward, to hedge against risk, and to protect themselves to some extent from China. So, yeah, similar words, very different kind of trajectories.
And just before Anna answers, I just, because we're wrapping up the panel now, I just wondered if all of the panelists, just to close out, can give one sentence or even one word on the expectations of the China-Europe relationship in the year ahead, and one area, if they wished Europe could get better at, the most important thing for its China policy that they would like to see differently. And so there's now a pause where people can think about that while Anna answers.
Okay, I think that we mentioned the paradigm or the need to balance between the interests and the values. And we are seeing that on the side of the EU. But I think we do not talk about enough on the side of China, because China has also this, I think, probably not a debate or division, but probably synergy between the interests and the values that it tries to pursue around the world. And while the linchpin of the cooperation throughout Europe with China in the past decade, I would say, has been predominantly economic, and there was very little discussion about the values, there is also, or there still is not sufficient discussion about the values that China tries to export in Europe. And I think that it is one of the objectives that China pursues. I think in the past decade, maybe some scholars were saying that, China has this principle of non-interference, so it allows other countries to do whatever they want, to organize themselves the way they want. But we are increasingly seeing specific and clear indications that China is trying to impose its own values, governance models, political norms outside. And you mentioned the loans. I think that is precisely where we are seeing this desire on the side of China, but we're not seeing the loans elsewhere in Europe, and that is why maybe they were not that much represented. It is only in the Western Balkans, as non-EU countries which do not have access to EU structural funds, that we see this openness. They're welcoming Chinese loans, and most of the time, everything that comes along, that means the Chinese values. We are seeing China negotiate agreements with these countries that will provide preferential treatment to Chinese companies without any open competitive procurement bids. We are seeing the undermining of the democratic institutions. So basically what we mentioned in terms of the institutions, they are not ready to deal with China, and it is a largely asymmetrical relationship. China asks them to sign up to laws, to bylaws, and to all different standards that simply undermine democratic processes, market economy, good governance, etc. And these countries are pretty much ready to do that, hoping to receive Chinese investments and Chinese loans. So I think that this is something that we must bear in mind and try to better understand, that we are not simply talking about protecting or pursuing the European values, but we need to bear in mind this goal of China not only to resist European values on its own turf, but also to promote its own version of the values abroad.
Thanks very much. So 2 closing sentences from each panelist, starting with Martin.
Right. So I think what we'll probably see in the near future in the relationship between Europe and the PRC will be ups and downs that we've seen so far. But the long-term trajectory, in my opinion, is downward. And we still haven't, the relationship still hasn't bottomed out. There really is a systemic rivalry. There are systemic differences that cannot be papered over. And what Europe needs, in my opinion, is to make the next logical step on the understanding that there is this systemic rivalry, and prepare also systematic policy responses, and that would cover the whole relationship. But to be able to do that, Europe would need some strategic unity that sadly has been lacking in the past. So I guess no more silly experiments like 16+1, and no more individual trips to Beijing by West European politicians.
Okay, I'm old, so I have seen predictions about the coming collapse of China one time too often. So my warning is arrogance and complacency are our enemies. So we should never be in the position where we lean back and say this will take care of itself or something like that. That's the first sentence. And the second is we need to do our homework instead of having completely polarized debate that basically take place in a vacuum. We need to collect the data, we need to know the facts, we need to know the degree of exposure, and we need to make priorities. What is critical infrastructure and what is not? And final word, I think if we frame everything in East-West terms, we are missing that a large part of the debate is North-South. So if we ignore the global South, we see the result, and we have seen the result in the resolutions in the UN against Russia, where big countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, all did not vote with the West. And we have to think very hard about that and whether we have lost the global South already.
The first one kind of picks up the title of this panel, right? We were talking about kind of a way towards a constructive European policy on China, and I think a core component of that is to have a much more informed discussion and also conversation with China that cuts through the bullshit that has built up over the past year in terms of mutual perceptions and kind of bursts through the kind of echo chambers in different capitals. Because the most important thing, I guess, going forward is to be really, really aware of wishful thinking, including on our own side. And to just pick up one example again that we discussed before, is how especially European media and also Scholz picked up a statement by Xi Jinping saying no use, or that he was against use of nuclear weapons in relation to to Russia's war in Ukraine. But if you look at the Chinese readout, it was template language saying, well, use of nuclear weapons is a bad thing. And that doesn't really indicate any position taking or any potential for China to step in as a mediator. And language does construct reality, and it's really important to look at what China is discussing also internally, especially in a forward-looking manner, because they're entirely decoupled alternative realities. And at some point, we need to bring them back together to avoid major escalation.
Thank you. Ana, to finish.
Thank you. I think that what it was Lao Tzu who was talking about, retreat, realign, regroup, recenter, and then go back in offensive again. And I think that that is very likely what we will be seeing on the side of China in future. China will try to portray itself as some sort of a savior, as a solution to Europe's problems, especially after the war in Ukraine. I don't think that it will go back on its position on Russia, but it will somehow try to build its and renew its own strength in dealing with Europe and try to be the constructive partner it used to be in the economic and financial crisis up to 2013. And in terms of what Europe should do, I think that if Europe cannot agree on what the maximum and the ultimate objective should be, it should at least agree on the minimum standards and norms in dealing with China in order to avoid a constant race to the bottom on the side of different EU and non-EU members. And just as it was said, I think that we need a more informed policies on China that will not be in terms of black and white, democratic, authoritarian, etc., but will take into account all the 50 shades of grey that we have in the cooperation.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, and thanks to each and all of the panelists, Martin, Gudrun, Katja, and Ana for wrapping up a really useful morning. Thanks.